JUNKANOO, no matter how much we love it, is not fit for church, nor for the realm of the holy, to some degree.
There was often a tension and an antagonism between the church and JUNKANOO.
JUNKANOO allows for a very unique form of expression of individuality.
I don't even know what to say. Well, let's call it a war, since we're talking about JUNKANOO. There's this ongoing war between Christmas and JUNKANOO. And this whole idea that these drums, these people, this dancing, this violence, this drunkenness, this whatever, this disguise, this unruliness, this violence is totally at odds with the sacredness of Christmas Day, and it should not have anything to do with it.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Centre for Black Theology at Queen's Foundation and this evening's Black Theology Forum. My name is Dulcie Dixon McKenzie, and I'm the director of the centre, and I'm really pleased to see you all. A few of you are on the call already, and we're expecting more, so we'll continue. Others have registered, so we're hoping people will hasten their footsteps and be with us very, very soon. So this is the forum that is held every month during term time, and it's primarily for people of African and Asian descent. And it is a space for critical theological conversations about the experience of Black and Brown people, especially our history and contemporary issues that matter. And this evening is an event that is a prime example of how studying theology can be enriched when we are inclusive, when we are interdisciplinary, and able to initiate alternative ways of thinking. It really is a special evening for one of our very own staff here at Queen's, as it's the book launch, Overcoming Self-negation by tutor, Rev Dr Carlton Turner. It is his debut book, but I am very sure it's not going to be his last. Indeed, I'm really pleased that we're able to invite you all as friends and family and colleagues from near and far to celebrate his work, his life, and this great book. We have on the call staff and students of Queen's. Nice to see you all. Friends and colleagues from other theological institutions. Hi there. And leaders and members from various churches and community projects. And we come from near and far, locally, nationally, and internationally. So welcome to everybody. This evening will be a very Caribbean conversation, a very Bohemian conversation, dare I say, because it's the birthplace and the heartbeat of Carlton. And so we're going to be hearing a lot of Caribbean voices this evening as we go through the evening in two parts. First, we'll hear from our speakers. We'll hear from Carlton first, Rev Dr Carlton Turner first. He's going to be sharing key points about his book. And then I'm delighted to be introducing to you Dr Nicolette Bethel. She's a cultural anthropologist, and she'll be sharing some thoughts about JUNKANOO, its importance for Bohemians and the potentials. Then we're going to be meeting a good friend of Carlton, Dr Ian Strachan. He's going to be sharing some thoughts on the colonial shaping of the Bahamas and why having an understanding of that is really, really important. And then we're going to have a break, just a 5-minute comfort break, because there's so much to fit in this evening. So enough to make us feel comfortable and want to go back, a commercial break if you like. Really pleased to be introducing to you Rev Canon Dr Kirkley Sands, who is a pioneer of research in Bohemian slave spirituality. Canon will give us a theological response and his thoughts about Carlton's book. And then we have our very own Rev Dr Evie Vernon O'Brien, a Jamaican Nannyish theologian. And if you're wondering, what do you mean by Nannyish? Just think of womanist. She's a Caribbean version of a womanist. And so Dr Evie will share some thoughts about Carlton's book and how it relates to Caribbean theology more broadly. The man of the hour is here. Carlton Turner, a Bohemian Anglican priest and Caribbean practical contextual theologian. As I say, he's a member of staff here at Queen's. And after training as a Spanish teacher and teaching for 3 years, he went on to study for ordained ministry at Condrington College, and that's in Barbados. Eventually, he became ordained in the Bahamas. So Carlton came to England to obtain his master's degree in mission studies here at Queen's Foundation, and he did that through the University of Birmingham, and he continued on to do his PhD in contextual theology. So he currently teaches contextual theology and mission studies, and his ministry as a priest has spanned both the Bahamas and the UK. So his book, which we're about to hear now, is his first publication, and indeed it is the publication of his PhD thesis. And we are really, really pleased that you're here with us. So Carlton, thank you. Congratulations. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dulcie. And good evening, everyone. Firstly, because I have limited time, let me say thanks to the Center for Black Theology, to Dr. Dulcie, Dixon, and this forum, which has been an intellectual space for me for more than 10 years, 10 to 12 years. And for all joining, you know, it's such a blessing. And for my fellow panelists whose work featured my work to one extent or the other, and who have shaped my thinking, I am absolutely amazed and thankful and grateful that you're here. But there's much to say. We're talking about JUNKANOO, and let me make the link for you. I'm going to share a video, just 2 minutes, and then I'm going to do a lot of talking. So this clip is from when I did research for the PhD and subsequently this book, but it's taken from the 2013 New Year's Day JUNKANOO parade. And for those who may not be aware, JUNKANOO, our New World Street Festival, celebrated across the Anglophone African Caribbean on Boxing Day and New Year's Day every year. I mean, forgiven COVID is another conversation. But for people in the UK and in other parts of the world, we might link that to West Indian carnival traditions of some sort, but hopefully you got a chance to see what I'm talking about. And in the Bahamas, for many reasons, this festival has been revived, revised, and is very much a symbol of national identity. And the church, for me, largely missionary in its origin, no matter the denomination, coming from Europe or North America, is also a part of Bahamian identity. Both are symbols. And it would be fair to say that they are identities that Bahamians perform, that they participate in. It's central to who we are. So a bit about the background to the research. The book is a version of my PhD research, which involved extensive qualitative ethnographic research, interviews, observations, checking the archives. And it was intentionally to research JUNKANOO and the church on their own terms. But it would not have been possible without people on the ground, JUNKANOO leaders, icons, church leaders, academics, theologians, historians, I mean, amazing people. The research question arose out of what I've always felt within my being, really, that there are two spheres of national life. There's a cultural and our cultural and religious identity exists between JUNKANOO and church in a symbolic way. But there's the idea that somehow they're antithetical, that JUNKANOO, no matter how much we love it, is not fit for church, nor for the realm of the holy to some degree. And to be clear, I'm not saying that the church is bad or that JUNKANOO is bad. I'm attacking or problematizing the relationship between the two. That's what the book tries to do. It is this tension that is in the literature when we consider people like W.E.B. Du Bois that Canon reminds us has Bahamian roots, Franz Fanon, Walter Rodney, and a host of other Caribbean intellectuals and Black intellectuals. And I've called this tension self-negation. The argument of the book is that there is a problematic, schizophrenic relationship between religion, let's slot in Christianity and the church, and culture. JUNKANOO is but an example, wherein African Caribbean religious and cultural heritages are considered antithetical, inappropriate, or even demonic for church use. But how could this be when the very same people occupy both spheres happily and freely? We come alive in both. Could it be that the hermeneutics around sacred and secular and the ways in which our faith is structured are still colonially informed? This is the question I asked. Could it be that the church practices are inherently perpetuating an anti-Africanness, even though we're now mostly a Black population? Could it be that within my body, within my mind, my heart, within my worship, that I carry a dissonance that needs to be addressed? And perhaps this isn't just about me, the individual. Perhaps it's national and regional, which is understandable when considering a history of plantation, slavery, and colonialism. Ian Strachan would call it Black Crab's tragedy. What am I offering? As a work in Caribbean contextual and practical theology, my country and my traditions have so much to offer the rest of the region, so much to offer the rest of the world. JUNKANOO and all the ways in which it brings harmony and healing to Bahamians, just like the church, deserves academic attention too. I'm also offering new ways of engaging. I want to suggest that within the region, these African traditional religious heritages, they matter. And they offer so much wisdom and healing. Suppressing them, minimizing them, vilifying them, is very much carrying on a pernicious colonial agenda. Why does all this matter to me? As a work in practical theology, I want to pay attention to hermeneutics. By that I mean, how do we arrive at our doctrines and practices? How do we hold them? And how do we come to evaluate or re-evaluate them? Indigenous traditions, be it the African Caribbean or anywhere in the global South or anywhere in the world, have so much to teach us. As a post-colonial theology, if I could use that term, I want to look at embodied ways in which practices of the church carry the same kind of colonial legacies. Multiple ways of continuing the same legacies are still in operation and still have the same desired effect. The effect is clear, that it produces dissonance, the undoing of Black bodies, the discouragement of new ways of interpreting and embodying Christianity. Christianity was never meant to be monocultural. I want to reframe the theological agenda. That's a bit ambitious, but I do. Colonialism, as it works itself out within theological traditions, often emphasizing being right. I think being right ultimately needs a counterpart, that something or someone is wrong. I'm concerned with what is wholesome, what is healing, and what tends towards a reimagined a healed world. I want to foreground healing. Within this space, Black theology, Caribbean theology, theologies of the third world, if we like that term, or the global south, have at their core a sense of resistance to racism, sexism, anti-Africanism, or some form of oppression or the other. But we need not forget an important point. We must remember to invest in the healing traditions that we currently possess. And JUNKANOO does that. Carnivals do that. Indigenous religious and cultural traditions do that. Yes, you have to fight racism and colonialism, but a part of that is healing. It is just interesting that within these discourses, the healing traditions themselves are marginalized, and that's a big mistake. I want to offer an interdisciplinary invitation. Theology, in my context and very much within its Western framing, needs conversation partners and must be held accountable, and particularly to the outworking of its ingrained, toxic, life-denying, anti-African, disembodied, dissociative, dichotomous, countersexual, and ultimately unrealistic tendencies. And one helpful suggestion that I've come to since this PhD was done 5 years ago, and since then my thinking has gone beyond, and I'm really interested in the insights of something like psychotherapy or clinical psychology, that these tensions need to be investigated not just by theology alone. We need help. And particularly in the Caribbean, we cannot talk or do God talk, at least not meaningfully, without the social sciences, without cultural studies, without historical studies. I come from a region that has been the ground of experiment within the modern world. And for the development of capitalism as we know it, those slave plantation societies fine-tuned the ways in which the West learned to build multiple empires of wealth that have meant often utter destruction for lives within the rest of the non-Western world. In closing, ultimately, I want to say that new ways of thinking, new ways of doing church can emerge that are healthy, wholesome, and reminiscent of that beatific vision, that heavenly vision of peace. But to do so, we need to stop the self-negation. I could say it another way, it's self-hatred, anti-Africanness, anti-I-ness. We must overcome it. And this is what I'm inviting us to do. So thank you very much, Dulcie.
Thank you, Carlton. Looking forward to speaking more with you later as we ask you questions, dig deeper into your book and the insights that you gained, as we also continue with the conversation with your colleagues as well. So there'll be more from Carlton later, but now we're going to move straight on now, speaking to one of his colleagues, Dr. Nicolette Bethel. She was born and raised in Bahamas, and she has lived, studied and worked here in the UK, as well as in Canada. Nicolette attended the University of Toronto and the University of Cambridge. She's educated in English and anthropology. She served as a director of culture for the Bahamas for some 5 years. And she's currently a playwright, poet, a fiction writer, a scholar who is associate professor of sociology and chair of social sciences at the University of the Bahamas. She's also a theatre producer and a director, and is festival director of the Shakespeare in Paradise Theatre Festival. She serves as a vice president of the Dunas Center for the Performing Arts of Bahamas, and her research interests include sustainable development, JUNKANOO, theatre, identity, gender, Bahamian literature, and Caribbean festival arts. So really good to see you, Nicolette. Thank you very much. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. I just want to get straight into it. I want to say, Carlton, I just want to pick up on the idea of self-negation, even though that wasn't what you asked me to do, because I think that that term works. Because I think that the term self-negation is perhaps more accurate in our context than some of the other terms that you mentioned, self-hatred and all the rest of that. That requires a consciousness and a self-awareness that is different from this erasure of self that I think is ongoing in the Bahamas and probably in the wider Caribbean as well. So what I would like to do now is I would like to just set the scene of JUNKANOO in the Bahamas. Just forgive me, I'm setting my timer so I don't go over. So Carlton gave a basic introduction to JUNKANOO, but JUNKANOO is part of that complex that came along with the eradication of the people of the Caribbean and the repopulation of the Caribbean with primarily forced laborers. And JUNKANOO is set side by side with and can be studied alongside Carnival, which we're much more familiar with around the world. But we have these two parallel and mutually, they give each other, they grow from each other and they have conversations. But there is some fundamental differentiation that I think is important because it allows us to look at this idea of self-negation and also to look at the role of the church and the place of the church with regard to JUNKANOO itself. So the Carnivalesque tends to go along with the Catholic settlement of the Caribbean and the Catholic colonies or formerly Catholic colonies, whereas the primarily Protestant colonies and the Anglophone Caribbean tended to have JUNKANOO. What are the differences? Carnival is associated with and integrated into the Catholic calendar. And so it is part of that pre-Lenten turning upside downness that occurred in the Mediterranean and that was transplanted to the Caribbean. And so there is an accommodation in those former colonies of the church and the Carnivalesque. Whereas in the Caribbean that did not have Carnival, that was Protestant, JUNKANOO is associated with Christmas and New Year's, with the Christmas time. And it is a relationship that often has an oppositional relationship between the church's calendar and the celebration that is JUNKANOO. In some places and at some points in time, there was accommodation, but primarily throughout the Caribbean and certainly in the Bahamas, there was often a tension and an antagonism between the church and JUNKANOO, because JUNKANOO took place on Christmas Day. And it is a celebration of noise. It is a celebration of Africa. It is a celebration of self at a time when the colonial powers are insisting on a focus upon the quiet, the family structure, the internal, the peace on earth kind of thing that's going on. So there's this inherent tension between Christmas and JUNKANOO. So much so that in the Bahamas, JUNKANOO traditionally took place on Christmas Day, but in the 1930s, JUNKANOO has been celebrated in the Bahamas from at least 1800. But in the 1930s, it was determined that JUNKANOO would no longer take place on Christmas Day. It would take place on Boxing Day. So we talk about the Boxing Day parade, but it was originally a Christmas festival. And in the last, I don't know how many years, 10 years, let's say, in the last decade, JUNKANOO, the Boxing Day parade, has been moved back to Christmas evening. So it begins now at 8 o'clock on Christmas evening. So that tension is maintained. And this is something that has been explored in the literature by Daniel Miller, who is looking at Carnival in Trinidad. And he talks about these twin celebrations, this opposition between the Christmas festival in Trinidad, which is very important, and Carnival. And the two of them are separated by 2 months. Now transplant this to the Bahamas, where you have the same kind of tension, but occurring one day apart or on the same day. So the tension and this antagonism, this conversation between JUNKANOO and the church is very real for Bahamians. And the complexity that Carlton explores in his book, I think, is really, really interesting. And the self-negation I think is necessary in both spheres, because you have to cut off a half of yourself or a part of yourself in order to participate and to perform in each environment. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make was that there's again, contrasting, I think, the carnivalesque and JUNKANOO, and I'm doing this on purpose because I want to come to where we are today, because JUNKANOO is itself in a process, undergoing a process of negation at this point in time over the last 2 or 3 years. But one of the things that is key in JUNKANOO that is different from the manifestation of carnival that we are familiar with and that we see certainly in Trinidad and Brazil, in Mardi Gras, is that the overwhelming symbolism that is associated with JUNKANOO is that of war. We have a very martial kind of music. When you analyze the music, it's got this 4/4 beat, this driving beat. We have this focus on strength and energy, which has to do with rushing. We have this requirement that you carry your own costumes, that you invest the time in building your own costumes, and that you are doing this all while playing music live. So the physical demands of JUNKANOO are very high. It is not a party, it is a war. And the war that takes place in Nassau has been transformed from an actual clash, which it used to be at the first half of the 20th century, an actual clash among neighborhood groups who would come and settle scores on Bay Street. It's now changed to a competition where that war has to do with who wins the parade, what the outcome of this competition is. So this again creates this tension and perpetuates this tension, because you have the symbolism of war, which is embedded in JUNKANOO, side by side with the symbolism of peace, which is embedded in Christmas. And also at odds with this revelry and partying that is integrated into the Catholic calendar with the pre-Lenten carnival, the saying goodbye to the flesh, this indulgence that happens right before Lent, which is very different from what JUNKANOO is doing in the Bahamas. Now, I said I wanted to end on that because about 5 years ago now, the Bahamian government decided that it was going to invest in a festival that was designed to have economic and touristic impact. And rather than investing in JUNKANOO and using JUNKANOO as the vehicle for that goal, it imported a version of Trinidad Carnival. And this created an uneasy marriage of JUNKANOO with the carnivalesque that I can talk a little bit more about if people are further interested in it during the discussion. But I wanted to say that even within JUNKANOO, we are experiencing at this point in time a self-negation that is not just in opposition to our Christianity and to the church, but also in opposition to our place in the region. The recognition in the Bahamas of the uniqueness of JUNKANOO and the power of JUNKANOO and the role of JUNKANOO on a global stage is not recognized. It is part of that process of self-negation. So I'm going to end there, and I'm just going to throw those things out, and if you're interested in them, we can discuss them more.
That's really helpful, Nicolette. Thank you. We look forward to coming back to you and asking you some questions about some of the things you said. Thank you. Let's move straight on then to the next speaker, Dr. Ian Strachan, another Bahamian and a good friend of Carlton's. Dr. Ian is the Vice President of the University of the Bahamas North and a Professor of English. He holds a AA in English and Literature from the University of the Bahamas and a Teacher Certificate from the University of the West Indies and a BA in English from Morehouse College, which he earned in 1990, and an MA in 1993, and a PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania. There's so much that I could say about Dr. Ian, but I'll move straight on by saying he is a poet, a playwright, novelist, a filmmaker, and his first novel was God's Angry Babies, and that was published in 1997. Maybe later you tell us more about that. But I'm going to move straight through to the bottom of your CV, so to speak. And just to say that Ian is a third generation educator. He teaches film, acting, creative writing, modern drama, as well as Caribbean, African and African American literature. Ian, it's really good to have you with us to celebrate your good friend and colleague, Carlton Turner. So we look forward now to hearing what you have to say in regards to his book and some of your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. An honor to be here, and congratulations to you, Carlton. Couldn't be happier for you. Like Nicolette, I think I'm going to deviate a bit from what I was invited to say. But first, just to speak to the issue of the colonial context of the Bahamas. Yeah, we are a former colony, a marginal colony in the context of Caribbean history, an archipelago, unevenly developed and overly centralized. Independence in 1973, and now a neo-colonial micro-state. And I guess in a nutshell, how I would describe us is as a people who inhabit, in many respects, North American imagination while walking a Caribbean landscape. So that there is a degree to which our minds are colonial and our bodies are Caribbean and African. And I would go so far as to say that in some respects, particularly if you're looking at, and Carlton gets into this in his book, depending on your denomination. So there's a difference between Methodism, Catholicism, Anglicanism, Presbyterians, and of course the Baptist and Pentecostal churches. How the body operates and how the disjuncture between mind and body varies based on that, and the degree to which Africanness is welcome in those spaces varies as well. I think Carlton gets into some of the subtleties about that. But in reading his work, what I want to add is a little bit of conversation about gender, actually. So I think one of the ways to think about the church and JUNKANOO in the Bahamian context is to think about it in gender terms. And Nicolette spoke to some of it when she used the metaphor of war, which is perfect, it's accurate. JUNKANOO, I would argue, is historically and now still predominantly a masculine space. One of the problems of the church in the Bahamas, and it's probably a problem of the late 20th century or even the last quarter century Bahamas, is that the church has become very much a feminine space, right? So JUNKANOO is in many respects a masculine space where the emphasis is muscularity, skill, outlaw behavior, reputation, the street, communal ownership, war, cultural resistance, symbolic revolution. Why do I say symbolic revolution? Because Black working class people come into the commercial center and take over. And whether you are, even if you are, whatever you are, merchant, politician, it's not your moment. It's the moment of the working poor and the middle class to some degree, but largely the working poor, because they are the real, the flesh and bones of JUNKANOO. And JUNKANOO is cultural resistance, and I think I mentioned that. I could also argue psychic, physical, and emotional release. JUNKANOO, though you're in a group and there could be 1,000 people, and there is some similarity, JUNKANOO allows for a very unique form of expression of individuality. JUNKANOO allows for satire, mockery, critique of the powerful and the famous, and unavoidably a celebration of sexual potency. Now, as women have entered into JUNKANOO and made it more egalitarian, I don't believe they are entirely on equal footing, but they are present in JUNKANOO to a greater extent than they would have been 60, 70 years ago. They too now bring the feminine dimension in terms of celebration of the body, right? Whereas the church is as I said, a very feminine space where respectability is emphasized. Sobriety is emphasized. And I think one of the points that Nicolette was getting at between the difference between the Catholic and the English in terms of the space they give for revelry, right? So Protestantism in the Bahamas means a religiosity which really emphasizes sobriety all the time and control and order. But then the church, the Baptist and the Pentecostal church, or what we call in the Bahamas the jumper church as well, there is a different experience of the body and a different approach to the spirit. So song, dance, the drum, possession by the spirit, these things have a space, right? And Carlton talks to all of that. So what is interesting too, so I think it's legitimate to think about these two experiences as important to contemplate, because they are both actually spiritual experiences, though, and I would agree with Nicolette, one is not consciously so. JUNKANOO is not consciously a spiritual thing, but we know that its origin is in ancestral masks. Those ancestral masks will have been born by men in the African context and born in secret societies of men. That's the roots of JUNKANOO, right? I think the last point I'll make is I've spent some time thinking about African retentions and ways in which African beliefs coexist alongside the Christian worldview, which we have adopted in the Bahamas. It's interesting. And I think one of the most interesting spaces is around beliefs about the dead. One of the most interesting outside of JUNKANOO, which is really about ancestral spirits, that's the origin, right? So that's too about the dead. But is just even dreams and number playing and believing in ancestors coming to you and giving you numbers which you then play and win. There's this, and these devout Christian people allow for this as a part of their experience of reality. All right. Although the official position of the church is staunch opposition to these things, this is happening amongst the membership, right? So the tension is a fascinating one, but my main point is to think too about how gender plays a role, and so that there are certain kinds of masculinity which don't seem to find space in the church, there's a difficulty there with the embodiment of Christ, who embodies love and mercy and forgiveness and humility, and the expression anti-colonial, anti-establishment, anti-class expressions of audacity, which JUNKANOO makes space for. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. We still have a bit of time, so I'm going to ask Carlton and Nicolette if you can come back. Let's just have a quick conversation about what you have all been saying to each other, about each other, and about JUNKANOO. So Ian, if you don't mind coming back, I want to pick up something you've said just a moment ago, Ian, before we come to Carlton and Nicolette. When you were saying there are distinctions between denominations in terms of the church, do you want to say a bit more about that? Because I'm a bit biased, I'm a Pentecostal, so I know JUNKANOO is a no-no, absolute no-no.
It's interesting. There's so many ways you could look at it, and Carlton could probably get into more detail. But there are spaces. For instance, you might be there are Anglican churches where you don't have drums and the rest, but then there was one that did, and took it there, and so but then too, let's say I am a JUNKANOO man, and I've risen to have some regard in the JUNKANOO community, and I pass. JUNKANOO may not be in the formal ceremony of the mass, right? The burial mass. But trust me, when we get out of the church and there's a procession, JUNKANOO will be present. I will be sent home with JUNKANOO. In fact, probably if there was a wake, which there normally would be, that too would be a space for JUNKANOO. So, and that's not a problem for most people, right? That's just a given. And even those people, even when, and Nicolette starts talking about it, but a lot of the core of JUNKANOO, a lot of it is marching band now, and marching brass band. It wasn't always so, but that's now the case. And so even when my mother was a devout Christian woman, a rock of the church, or when she was buried, there was no JUNKANOO, but there was a marching band. And my oldest brother who died, there was a marching band. She wanted that to send my brother Winston off, and we did when she died. And I remember when my father died, who was a staple in St. George's Church. When we were entering into the church, one of my half brothers, God Chippy Chipman, he stood at the gate of St. Agnes Church beating a JUNKANOO drum as we entered into the church. So even if you don't let it in, it'll be right on the outside waiting for you.
Thank you, Ian. I don't know if you want to come into that, Carlton, because you're shaking your head a lot.
No, I mean, they're spot on, and these are the experts really. But for me, it's just unfortunate that we have to inhabit two spaces, and that there's probably good reason for that. But I'm concerned with what that does overall, and particularly for people who have such a history and a legacy of this kind of dissociation, this dissonance. And what I'm interested in is the fact that we are passionate people, period. But when we continue to think that somehow we become a new person when we enter one space or the other, then I don't think that's cool. Yes, JUNKANOO will be there whether it's masked or not.
Yeah.
And on a JUNKANOO parade, church will be there whether it's masked or not.
Yeah. Especially New Year's Day, because you just wait for "Spare Me Another Year, Oh Lord." You can't have a New Year's JUNKANOO without somebody playing that song. So church hymns are played in the parade proper, as well as Nicolette could verify. Yeah.
Nicolette, you mentioned the change of day, didn't you, for JUNKANOO? I don't know if you want to say more about that, because you've now just introduced something else, Ian, about New Year's Day.
Well, yeah, okay. So there were a couple. Just to add to this conversation, there is a theory that the winningest JUNKANOO group might put forward, because I do believe that the Valley Boys still hold the highest number. Apologies to all non-Valley Boys in this gathering, but I believe they still hold the record for the highest number of wins. And one of the reasons they explain that is that for much of their early lives, they were blessed by Father Eldon, later Bishop Eldon, who would not allow them to go out to the parade without that blessing. So there's this tension, and they came out of St. George's, which is another reason. And Bishop Eldon was my uncle, and when he died, his body was resting in St. George's, and then the JUNKANOO group, the Valley Boys, rushed him to Cathedral, where his body then lay in state. for to integrate him into this whole thing. So Carlton, you may not have been aware of that, but that is one of the things that so there's everything, all of this stuff happens under the surface. But to get back to the whole question of Christmas, and if you look through the literature, and the literature that you mostly look through is letters to the editor and editorials and things like that, there is this ongoing I don't even know what to say. Well, let's call it a war, since we're talking about JUNKANOO. There's this ongoing war between Christmas and JUNKANOO. And this whole idea that these drums, these people, this dancing, this violence, this drunkenness, this whatever, this disguise, this unruliness, this violence is totally at odds with the sacredness of Christmas Day, and it should not have anything to do with it. Now, also to contextualize it slightly more interestingly, JUNKANOO falls under, when you look at it from the space of official administrative policy, it falls under the Ministry of Youth, Sports, and Culture, which means that when I was director of culture at the time, there was this fundamental, again, dichotomy within the ministry that administered it. One of the things that the ministry refused to allow in the sponsorship of JUNKANOO was alcohol, even though alcohol companies and liquor companies are major sponsors of carnivals and so on everywhere, because JUNKANOO was also falling under the Ministry of Youth. And all my arguments that said that these are two separate things, you have culture, you have youth, they can be separated, people can actually make a distinction, fell on deaf ears. Now this has changed over time, but we have all these levels of, of tension. And at the root of that tension is this suspicion that we attach to JUNKANOO in its, and Carlton talks about it, and unfortunately I haven't really got into those chapters, but he talks about that in the whole context of sin and the idea of sin. And JUNKANOO is very often weighted on that sin side. And yeah.
Can I just quickly add something? Historically, right, Nicolette, JUNKANOO happens on Christmas Day for a reason which is historical, which is it has to do with slavery.
Yes, absolutely.
When we are not working.
That's right.
You give us a holiday. And so in this moment, we celebrate our Africanness. We celebrate in the way we know how to celebrate and give honor, right?
Yeah.
So it was not some, let's just annoy the church, let's just defy the church on the happiest of days. Truly, this was when slaves were free to express themselves.
Yeah.
This was the time they were given. And so this was when they did it.
You make us really, really interesting points, and we've got some questions in the chat. We'll take these two questions and then we'll have a break. We'll go with the second one because that goes towards what you're saying, Ian, and then we'll come back to you, Nicolette. What is the political expediency of denying and suppressing traditional religious thinking in JUNKANOO and other Afrocentric practices and beliefs? Why has it been necessary to shield Jesus from them? Christianity can and does exist through this. I don't know who wants to take this up. We're going to talk more theology after the break, but I don't know if you want to take that one, Ian. Yeah.
Me?
Or Carlton? Go ahead, Carlton, the theologian.
I think Carlton, I'd love to hear Carlton's answer. I would just say, I don't know that for our people, this was a case of forgetting more than anything. Not a case of stamping out, but a case of forgetting.
What do you mean by forgetting? You mean losing it by memory or wanting to forget it?
I suppose you can't ignore the level of volition in it, right? But a people brought across from Africa, remember, this is how we celebrate. This is how we affirm ourselves. But over time, it loses the meaning of it in the sense of ancestral honor, right? And it still becomes something where there's fear, and it's male dominated, and there's all these emotions being summoned, but the spiritual side of it, the origin of it, as ancestral worship, if you will, or ancestral remembrance, is lost. It's simply forgotten. Christianity takes that place. I don't know that it was. It just wasn't retained. I could say it different ways, but
Let's let Carlton come on in then.
Yeah. I would disagree. Allow me to, to disagree.
please do.
Yeah, beyond it being forgotten, I think it was forgotten for a reason. And a lot of this hinges on education. What JUNKANOO and JUNKANOOs try to do is through practice, through embodied ways, through gathering, trying to remember, trying to activate, to relive in many ways. But there is a constant hermeneutic, that's my language, that says this needs to be forgotten because it's evil, because it's bad. And if you take decades upon decades and centuries of this kind of teaching, naturally forgetting takes place. It wasn't an unintentional forgetting, it was very intentional. And I want to get back to that dynamic of why, you know.
Good. That's something to pick up. And then if Nicolette, you can, I'm going to give you the last word before we have a break. So go ahead.
Okay, well, I just want to throw out this provocation, Carlton, and maybe you and Father Sands can pick it up. It seems as though, it's a fact that the churches that we see as representing the most Europeanized, the denominations that represent the Europeans, are more accommodating of JUNKANOO than the denominations that are more African in celebration and identification, which are the least accommodating of JUNKANOO. Just to throw that out there and let you respond to that.
Yeah, no, that was something that I encountered that very much surprised me. So, for example, you cannot, try as you might, you cannot take away the Anglican participation in JUNKANOO. And try as you might, one of the things I found is the denomination that was most, through interviews and actually through observation and through archives, the denomination that seemed to be most accommodating to JUNKANOO and that expression of Bahamian identities and spirituality was the Roman Catholics. And I was very surprised in terms of having a JUNKANOO mass and that sort of stuff. And there are some people who take it seriously, and some churches, but on the whole, it seems like, sorry, Dulcie, the jumper churches, the Pentecostal churches. Oh my God. And it's so unfortunate. I had this experience where I was going to the parade to do my research. And it was the Junior JUNKANOO. Junior JUNKANOO is where all the schools compete. And so it's a big thing across the nation. And I passed to historic Baptist churches on Meeting Street. And they were having their own other thing with their young people. And it was almost unintentional. We don't participate in this JUNKANOO thing. I could be wrong. That's just how I interpreted it. But the jump up Pentecostal, those kinds of churches, this happens. But then there are exceptions. I cannot do this work without talking about churches that have been considered JUNKANOO churches. And some of my participants have been very much, their purpose has been to do God, to do church on Bay Street through JUNKANOO because it's a ministry.
Okay, thank you. Let's give this last question to you, Nicolette, and let you just finish off with this. In response to your comment about self-negation taking place in both spaces, what kinds of self-negation take place within JUNKANOO? Is that not the place of fuller expression in comparison to the church?
So I think what I was talking about is so I would say there are two sides to that. The self-negation, JUNKANOO is in danger, I think. It's walking a very thin line of, if people are familiar here with the idea of custom versus tradition, the Hobsbawm idea of custom being something that is lived and celebrated versus tradition, which is something that is passing away that we want to preserve and understand. JUNKANOO is on the verge of becoming tradition. It is not something that is currently practiced by people who are under 40 years old. And there's a number of reasons for that I can go into that make a lot of sense. But I think that's where I'm talking about the self-negation. For that group of people, particularly people under the age of 40, who are also not the working poor, as Ian talks about, Carnival is more of a lived reality for them than JUNKANOO. They will travel to Trinidad to go to Carnival. They're the ones who invested in Bahamas JUNKANOO Carnival. They don't have a connection to JUNKANOO. Like I said, there is a reason that I can use to explain. And there's a parallel with that with churches as well. It has to do with territory, and it has to do with JUNKANOO being practiced in working class neighborhoods, but not in middle class suburban neighborhoods. And churches also that came out of working class neighborhoods, many people go back to that church, which is still in the working class neighborhoods. They are less well populated in the suburbs. So there's, and I think that's what I'm getting at, this whole idea that we are running the danger of JUNKANOO becoming the old people's tradition, the old people's custom, and young people are looking at something very different moving forward.
And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because to do JUNKANOO, you kind of need the energy. You need that feistiness, surely.
Yes, absolutely.
May I say something before we break, Dulcie?
Okay, it's your book after all.
Amen. Well, I mean, just going back to the Pentecostal churches, but I can't sit here and not name somebody like Henry and Ann Higgins, with their group Conquerors for Christ. I mean, it goes back to this is very gendered, if we want to use that term. But here Henry's bringing it conquerors. Sounds like a very Pentecostal thing, conquering for Christ. But for Christ, that bringing the church and this religious and cultural dynamic together in a creative way, people are doing that. But guess what? Such people are often marginalized and not heard.
Good place to leave it for now. We've got some other questions mounting, which is good. Keep them coming through, actually, everyone. If you have a question, please put question and then ask your question, and we'll try and pick it up after the break. I think it feels like time for a break now, even for 5 minutes, refresh ourselves and come back. And when we come back, we're going to talk all things theology with Canon Kirkley Sands and Reverend Evie Vernon O'Brien. And we're going to continue a conversation with Nicolette and Ian, and of course Carlton as well, when all of them come back together. So thank you very much for now. Thank you, everyone. Let's just take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and talk theology. Thank you. Welcome back. We now look forward to hearing from you with your theological insights. Welcome.